My name's Sophie. I'm 30 years old. And before anyone says anything, let me just get this out there. I know how bad this sounds. I cheated on my husband with his best friend on our actual wedding day. And I've had a lot of time since then to sit with that sentence and try to understand how I became a person capable of doing something like that. So let me start from the beginning, because I don't think you will. I can understand what happened at that wedding without understanding everything that led up to it. I met Ethan when I was 23. We were both working at the same marketing agency. Him in analytics, me in creative. And he was exactly the kind of steady, dependable guy that everyone tells you to want. He showed up on time, he remembered things, he never played games. He told me he loved me for the first time on our 4-month anniversary in this very sincere, very unrehearsed way that made my roommate at the time say, "Oh my God, he's marrying you someday." And she was right. Within 5 years, we were engaged. And honestly, for most of those 5 years, I want to be clear, I was happy. Or at least I told myself I was happy. Ethan is a good man. I need to say that up front, because everything I'm about to describe doesn't change that fact. He's kind. He's loyal. He's the kind of person who remembers your coffee order and shows up to help you move without being asked, and never once in 5 years gave me a real reason to doubt him. But here's the thing about Ethan that I didn't fully admit to myself until much later. He is also deeply predictable in a way that started to feel less like stability and more like a slow kind of suffocation. Our dates were always the same. 3 restaurants rotated in the same order. Our vacations were planned 8 months in advance, down to the dinner reservations. He wore the same 5 outfits on rotation and got visibly uncomfortable if I suggested doing something spontaneous. Like, hey, let's just drive somewhere this weekend and see where we end up. He'd get this anxious look and start asking logistics questions. Where would we stay? What about work on Monday? Do we have enough gas money? And I want to be fair here, because I think some of this is just who Ethan fundamentally is as a person. He grew up with parents who valued routine and security above almost everything else. His dad was in insurance for 35 years, never changed jobs, never took a real risk, and Ethan absorbed that completely. He finds comfort in the predictable, the same way some people find comfort in chaos. And for a long time, I told myself that was a good thing. That was maturity. That was what a real partner looked like compared to whatever flighty, unreliable men I dated in my 20s before him. I want to describe the engagement itself because I think it actually foreshadowed a lot of what came later. Ethan proposed on our 3rd anniversary, which was exactly on schedule with the timeline he had apparently mapped out in his head from very early on. He took me to the same restaurant we'd had our first date at, which I found sweet at the time, and had the ring hidden in a dessert that the waiter brought out at a very specific, prearranged moment. And everything about it was lovely and thoughtful, and also completely without a single surprise in the actual execution, because Ethan had told his mother the exact date 3 months in advance, had confirmed with the restaurant twice, and had even, I found out much later, sent my best friend a text the week before to make sure I didn't have any conflicting plans that evening. It worked perfectly. It was a beautiful proposal, and I cried real tears and said yes without hesitation. And I also remember lying in bed that night next to my new fiancé, thinking something I immediately felt guilty for thinking, which was I already knew exactly how this was going to happen. There was a vacation about a year before. The wedding that I think about a lot now, looking back. We had gone to visit some friends who had just bought a small cabin near a lake, and on the second night there, The friends suggested this spontaneous idea of driving 40 minutes to a nearby town because there was apparently some small local festival happening that weekend. Live music, food trucks, the whole thing. Nothing complicated, nothing that required real planning. And I remember feeling this immediate surge of excitement at the idea and looking over at Ethan, already knowing what his face was going to look like before he even said anything. He did the math out loud. He said, "What time would we get back? Would there be parking? Is it worth driving 40 minutes each way for something we don't know much about?" And our friends, who didn't know Ethan as well as I did, just kind of laughed it off. Like, "Oh, come on, live a little." And Ethan smiled along, but ultimately said, "You guys go ahead. I think I'll just stay back and relax." Which meant I stayed back too, because I felt like I couldn't leave him alone at someone else's cabin. And I remember sitting on that porch that evening, watching the sun go down, feeling this specific flavor of resentment that I didn't have a name for yet. Just this quiet, grinding disappointment that I pushed down and told myself was unfair to feel. Because Ethan hadn't done anything wrong, technically. He had just expressed a preference, and I had chosen to honor it. But somewhere in me, a small account was opening that would keep a running tally over the next several years. Now, let me introduce the other person in this story. His name is Marcus, and he had been Ethan's best friend since college. They met freshman year in some required gen ed class and became inseparable, the way college friendships sometimes do. Marcus was best man material from basically the moment Ethan and I started dating. Everyone already knew it. Marcus is loud where Ethan is quiet. He's spontaneous where Ethan is careful. He runs his own small business doing custom furniture and woodworking, which sounds like it shouldn't be glamorous, but somehow on him, it was. He'd show up to things with sawdust still on his jeans and stories about some insane client request he'd just pulled off. And I remember the very first time I met him at some barbecue Ethan's college friends threw, thinking, okay, this is exactly the kind of guy I'd have fallen for in a different life, and then immediately feeling guilty for thinking it, because I was there with Ethan. I want to be honest that Marcus and I had a specific kind of chemistry from almost the beginning. Not romantic exactly, at least not that none of us would have called it that at the time, but this easy banter, this way of finishing each other's sentences and getting each other's jokes instantly in a way that felt different from how I connected with Ethan's other friends. Ethan actually used to joke about it. He'd say, "You two are gonna run off together someday," in this totally unbothered way, because it genuinely never occurred to him that there was anything to worry about. And for years, there wasn't. There really wasn't. I need to be clear about that, because I think it's important context. Nothing physical happened between Marcus and me for the entire 5 years Ethan and I were together before the wedding. Nothing. Not a kiss, not anything. We were just friends who happened to get along extremely well, and who happened to spend a lot of time together, because he was Ethan's best friend, and I was Ethan's girlfriend, and then fiancé, and that proximity was completely normal and expected. There are a few specific memories from those years that I find myself returning to now, which I think tell you more about what was actually happening beneath the surface than I let myself admit at the time. There was a group camping trip about 2 years into dating Ethan, where a sudden storm rolled in and collapsed half our gear. And while Ethan spent a frantic 20 minutes on his phone trying to find the nearest hotel with vacancy, Marcus just started laughing, this big, unbothered laugh, and said, "Well, I guess we're building a blanket fort then." And somehow, within an hour, he had rigged this genuinely impressive shelter out of tarps and rope, and we all ended up crammed in there playing cards by flashlight while the rain came down. And it remains one of my favorite nights of my entire 20s. Ethan eventually gave up on finding a hotel and joined us, but he spent the whole night visibly tense, checking his phone for the weather radar every 20 minutes, while Marcus told stories that had all of us in tears laughing. There was another time, this one about 3 years in, when I was going through a rough patch with a difficult client at work and had basically stopped answering anyone's texts for a few days out of stress and pure exhaustion. And it was Marcus who eventually just showed up unannounced at my apartment with takeout from my favorite Thai place because Ethan had mentioned offhandedly that I'd been quiet lately, and Marcus had apparently just decided to do something about it. While Ethan's version of concern had been to send a single text asking if everything was okay and then wait for me to respond on my own time. I remember opening the door and just starting to cry a little from the sheer relief of having someone show up in person. And Marcus just sat on my couch with me for 2 hours, not even really talking most of the time, just being present while I decompressed. And I think that night specifically planted something in me, a sense that there was a version of being cared for that felt different, fuller somehow, more embodied than the version I was used to receiving from Ethan, who loved me completely, I want to be clear about that, but who expressed it in this very controlled, almost administrative way, checking boxes, being reliable, but rarely showing up in the messy, unscheduled moments the way Marcus seemed to do, instinctively. But I think somewhere over those years, I started keeping a kind of internal ledger, without fully admitting it to myself. A mental catalog of every time Marcus made me laugh so hard I cried, against every time Ethan responded to something exciting with a careful, pragmatic question about logistics. Every time Marcus showed up with some spontaneous idea, against every time Ethan needed 48 hours notice to consider doing anything outside his routine. And I think that ledger was quietly tipping in a direction I wasn't willing to look at directly. Wedding planning made everything worse in ways I didn't expect going into it. Ethan approached our wedding the exact same way he approached everything in his life, which is to say with spreadsheets and timelines and zero tolerance for spontaneity. We had a color-coded planning document with over 40 tabs. He wanted every vendor contract triple-checked before signing. He had opinions about our seating chart that came from some logic about who should not be within conversational distance of whom, based on old family dynamics, I found genuinely exhausting to track. There's one specific fight I remember clearly from about 4 months before the wedding that I think captures the whole dynamic. I had found this small string quartet online who did modern arrangements of pop songs, and I got so excited about the idea of them playing during the ceremony instead of the standard classical pieces. And I brought it to Ethan practically vibrating with excitement, showing him videos on my phone. And he watched for a minute and then said this very reasonable sounding thing, which was, "That's really cool, but the venue coordinator said the classical trio she recommended has done probably 200 weddings there and knows the acoustics of the space perfectly. Do we really want to risk something unfamiliar?" And I said, "Ethan, it's not a risk, it's music. Worst case, it's slightly different than we planned." And he said, "But why take that chance when we have a known good option?" And I remember standing in our kitchen with my phone still open to the video, feeling this specific kind of deflation, like a balloon slowly losing air. And I said, "Fine, whatever you think is best," and walked away. And later that same night, I texted Marcus venting about it, not even mentioning what the specific issue was, just something like, "Ethan shot down another idea today. Sometimes I feel like this wedding is going to look exactly like every other wedding that's ever happened at that venue." And Marcus wrote back something like, "Well, at least you'll always know what to expect," which somehow, coming from him, felt like it was said with this knowing understanding of exactly what I meant that Ethan himself never quite seemed to grasp when I tried to express it directly to him. And every single time I tried to suggest something a little different, a slightly unconventional first dance song, a food truck instead of a plated dinner, a later start time so we could catch the sunset during photos, he'd get this same anxious tightness around his eyes and explain very patiently why the traditional version was safer, more reliable, more likely to go according to plan. And I went along with basically all of it because I told myself it mattered more to him than it did to me, which in fairness was probably true. But I also noticed how often I was quietly deferring, how often my own preferences were getting sanded down in favor of whatever felt safest to him. And somewhere in the 8 months of wedding planning, I started spending more time venting to Marcus than I probably should have. He was helping build some of the reception decor as a gift to us, these custom wooden centerpiece stands and displays, and that meant regular check-ins, texts about design details, late-night calls about logistics, and increasingly, those conversations drifted from wedding stuff into just talking the way we always had, except now it was happening constantly instead of occasionally. I remember one specific night, about 6 weeks before the wedding, when Ethan had gone to bed early, like he always did, and I was up late texting Marcus about something completely unrelated to the wedding, just talking about a show we were both watching. And I looked up, and it was almost 1 in the morning, and I had this brief flash of thought, like, what am I doing right now? This is not what engaged women do the night before their fiancé goes to sleep at 9:30. And I closed my phone and told myself it was nothing. It was just friendship. It was just because Ethan went to bed so early that there was simply more time in the evening for other conversations to fill, which sounds like a reasonable explanation until you sit with how much effort I was putting into constructing it. The morning of the wedding started at my mother's house, with my 2 bridesmaids and a mimosa I barely touched because I was too nervous to actually drink much of anything before noon. My mother kept fussing over the veil, adjusting it every few minutes, even when it didn't need adjusting, just because she needed something to do with her hands. And at one point, she took my face in both her hands and said, "You have no idea how happy I am for you. This man is going to take care of you your whole life." And I remember feeling this genuine warmth at hearing that, completely uncomplicated by anything else. Because at that point in the morning, nothing had happened yet. Nothing was wrong yet. I was simply a woman getting ready to marry someone she loved. My hair and makeup took almost 3 hours, and somewhere in the middle of it, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus that just said, "Tell the bride she looks perfect before she even sees a mirror. Ethan's a lucky idiot," which made me laugh out loud in the middle of getting my eyeliner done. And I remember one of my bridesmaids asking who that was, and me saying, "Oh, just Marcus being Marcus," in this offhand way that didn't feel significant at the time. The ceremony itself was held outdoors, under this arch covered in white flowers that had taken the florist and Ethan's mother nearly a full day to assemble. The weather cooperated perfectly, which, given how much Ethan had stressed about backup rain plans for 8 straight months, felt like a small God gift, a miracle in itself. I remember walking down the aisle on my father's arm and seeing Ethan's face the moment he saw me, and it is one of the most sincere expressions of love I have ever seen on another human being's face. Even now, looking back on everything that followed, I will not take that memory away from what it actually was in that moment. My father squeezed my hand right before he handed me off at the end of the aisle and whispered, "You ready?" And I said yes, without an ounce of hesitation, because in that specific moment, I meant it completely. Whatever came apart later in the day, the person standing at that altar saying yes was not performing anything. She genuinely believed it. The ceremony was beautiful. The vows were beautiful. Ethan had written his own, which was unusual for him, because he generally preferred using traditional language he trusted and had researched thoroughly, rather than risking something original and unpolished. But for this, He had apparently drafted and redrafted his vows for weeks, according to his mother. And when he read them out loud, his voice already unsteady, he said something about how he used to think love was supposed to feel like fireworks, but that what he'd found with me felt more like a house, something steady you could return to every single day, and trust would still be standing. And Ethan's voice cracked slightly when he got to the part about choosing me every day, which surprised everyone a little, because he is not usually a person who shows that much emotion in front of a crowd. And I remember feeling so moved by that crack in his composure, like I was witnessing something genuinely rare being given to me. The reception followed at a barn venue, about 20 minutes from the ceremony site. String lights and long farm tables, and Marcus gave a best man toast that had half the room laughing and the other half crying, which is exactly what a good best man toast should do. He told this story about how Ethan had once driven 4 hours in a snowstorm to help him move apartments freshman year of college without complaining once, and used it to talk about what a steady, loyal friend Ethan had always been. And there was this moment during the toast where Marcus looked directly at me, raising his glass, and said, "And Sophie, somehow you found the one man patient enough to actually deserve you," which got this big laugh from the room, and I remember laughing along too, but also feeling this strange, hot flush at being singled out like that in front of everyone, in a way that felt different from the normal warmth of a wedding toast. Dinner followed the toast, a plated meal exactly as Ethan had planned it, and I remember making small talk with relatives I hadn't seen in years, my great aunt asking me twice how we met, one of Ethan's cousins showing me photos of her new baby on her phone. All of it perfectly pleasant and completely unremarkable in the way most of a wedding reception actually is between the big emotional moments. The reception itself was a blur of dancing and photos and family members I hadn't seen in years. And at some point during the open bar hour before dinner, I had more champagne than I probably should have, which I think matters as context, not as an excuse. I want to be extremely clear. I'm not saying I was blackout drunk or not responsible for my choices. I remember everything that happened with total clarity. I just want to be honest that my inhibitions were lower than normal, which probably made it easier to act on feelings I had spent years successfully not acting on. There was a moment during the dinner hour, before any of what happened outside, where I caught myself watching Marcus across the room while he was refilling water glasses for an elderly relative at one of the tables, laughing at something she said, completely unhurried and present, in a way that struck me even then, as I sat there in my wedding dress next to my new husband, who was quietly checking the time on his phone to make sure the schedule for the toasts stayed on track. And I remember feeling this small, guilty pang of noticing the contrast so clearly on the exact day I was supposed to be least aware of it. Around 9 that evening, during a lull between the dinner and the dancing, I stepped outside the reception hall to get some air. My dress was heavy and the hall was warm, and Marcus happened to be out there too, having stepped away from best man duties for a few minutes, and we ended up talking the way we always did, easily, comfortably, and at some point the conversation shifted into something more sincere. He said something about how happy he was for us, how he'd genuinely never seen Ethan this happy in the 15 years he'd known him. And I said something back about how lucky I felt. And then, almost without meaning to, I added something I hadn't planned to say at all. Something like, sometimes I wonder what would have happened if things had gone differently, if I'd met you first instead. And I watched something shift in his face the moment I said it. This flicker of surprise, followed almost immediately by something else entirely. Something that told me he had wondered the exact same thing at some point over the years, without ever saying it out loud either. And there was this pause, this specific charged pause that I think we both felt at exactly the same moment, where neither of us said anything. And I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I knew in that pause exactly what was about to happen. And I did not stop it. I want to own that completely. I was not swept away against my will. I was a full participant in every choice that followed. We ended up in a side hallway near the coat check, away from the main flow of guests. And what happened between us that night happened there, in the span of maybe 10 or 15 minutes total, while my own wedding reception continued 50 feet away. I am not going to describe the specifics of it, because I don't think reliving that level of detail serves any purpose, except to say that it happened. It was not a kiss that got out of control. Out of hand? It went further than that. And afterward, I remember standing in that hallway, smoothing my dress back into place, feeling this specific kind of sick that I had never experienced before in my life, like my whole body had gone cold from the inside, even though the hallway itself was warm. Marcus looked as shaken as I felt. He said something like, "Sophie, oh my God, what did we just do?" And I said, I don't know. And we stood there for a moment, just looking at each other in this horrified silence, before both of us straightened our clothes and walked back into the reception separately, about 90 seconds apart, like we had rehearsed it, even though we hadn't discussed a single word of a plan. I danced with my new husband 20 minutes later at the reception, smiling for photos, laughing with my bridesmaids, cutting the cake with a hand that was still faintly shaking. And I want to be honest that this is the part of the story that I have the hardest time forgiving myself for. Not necessarily the act itself, which was obviously terrible, but the fact that I was able to compartmentalize it that thoroughly. That same night that I could stand next to Ethan an hour later while he told our wedding photographer, "This is the best day of my life," and smile back at him like nothing had happened. The reception wound down around midnight, and Ethan and I left for the hotel suite his parents had booked for us as a wedding gift. And I remember sitting in the back of the car on the way there, with my head on his shoulder, him practically glowing with happiness, running through highlights of the day out loud. Remember when my dad started crying during the father-daughter dance? Remember Marcus's toast? I still can't believe how well that went. And every single mention of that name landed in my chest like a small stone dropping into still water. And I just kept nodding and saying, yeah, it was perfect, in this voice that I hoped sounded normal. We got to the suite, and there were rose petals on the bed that the hotel staff had arranged as part of the package his parents paid for, and champagne on ice. And Ethan pulled me close and said, I keep waiting for this day to feel less like a dream and more real. And I remember standing there in his arms in that beautiful suite, feeling like the single most fraudulent version of myself I had ever been, smiling and kissing him back and saying something like, I know, me too, while some other part of my brain was still replaying those 10 or 15 minutes in the hallway on an endless loop. I didn't sleep much that night, lying next to my new husband while he slept peacefully beside me, completely unaware, staring at the ceiling of that hotel suite, turning the same thought over and over, which was some version of, what have I done? What have I done? What have I done? And somewhere around 4 a.m, I finally drifted off from pure exhaustion, only to wake up a few hours later to Ethan already up and ordering room service, cheerful and rested in a way that made the gap between his experience of that morning and mine feel almost unbearable. Ethan and I left for our honeymoon 2 days later, a 10-day trip to Portugal that we had been planning for almost a year. And I want to describe what that honeymoon was actually like, because I think it matters. It was not the romantic dream trip it was supposed to be. Not because Ethan did anything wrong, but because I spent almost every single day of it carrying this enormous secret that I could feel physically, like a stone lodged somewhere behind my ribs. Ethan kept commenting on how quiet I seemed, how distracted, and I kept blaming it on wedding exhaustion or jet lag or the heat. And he accepted those explanations completely because he had genuinely no reason not to. There's a specific kind of loneliness in being surrounded by someone who loves you completely while you are hiding something that would destroy that love if they knew it. And I felt that loneliness every single day of that honeymoon. There was a day about midway through the trip where we took a day tour out to this stunning coastal town. Cliffs and blue water and these narrow cobblestone streets. And Ethan was in genuinely great spirits the whole day, taking pictures of everything, holding my hand as we walked, at one point stopping in the middle of the street just to kiss me for no particular reason and say, "I can't believe we get to do this for the rest of our lives." And I remember smiling and kissing him back and feeling this awful doubled experience of actually being happy in that exact moment while simultaneously being aware of the things sitting underneath it that made the happiness feel borrowed somehow, temporary. Like I was spending money I didn't actually have. There was one night in Lisbon where we were having dinner at this beautiful restaurant overlooking the water, and Ethan reached across the table and took my hand and said, "I still can't believe you're my wife. I feel like the luckiest man alive." And I had to excuse myself to the bathroom because I thought I might actually be sick from the guilt. Sitting in that bathroom stall, gripping the edge of the sink, I remember making a decision that I now understand was the wrong one, which was that I was never going to tell him. I told myself it would only hurt him for absolutely nothing, that it had been a single, isolated incident born out of stress and champagne and years of unexpressed feelings that would never happen again, and that confessing would just be an act of selfishness on my part, unloading my guilt onto him. So I could feel better while destroying his entire understanding of our wedding day. I told myself I was protecting him, which I understand now was really just a more sophisticated way of protecting myself. We came home from the honeymoon and settled into married life, and outwardly everything looked completely normal. We moved into the house we had bought together before the wedding. We settled into routines. Ethan went back to his job. I went back to mine. But internally, I was a different person than I had been before that hallway. I started avoiding Marcus completely, which Ethan noticed almost immediately, because Marcus had been such a constant presence in our lives for years. He asked me a few weeks after we got back why I hadn't mentioned hanging out with Marcus, and I said something vague about being busy with settling back into work. And Ethan let it go, because, again, he had no reason not to. There was one moment, about 3 weeks after we got back from the honeymoon, where I ran into Marcus completely by accident at the grocery store, both of us reaching for the same brand of coffee in the same aisle. And I remember physically freezing when I saw him, my whole body going rigid in this way that I'm sure looked strange to anyone watching. And he looked equally frozen for a second before saying, "Hey," in this careful, neutral voice. And we ended up having the most stilted 5-minute conversation of our entire friendship standing in that aisle. Both of us talking about completely mundane things, the weather, his latest furniture commission, anything that wasn't the actual thing sitting between us. And at one point, there was this silence that stretched a beat too long, and he just said, "Take care of yourself, Sophie," before turning and walking toward the checkout without finishing whatever he'd come in for. And I stood there in the coffee aisle for a solid minute after he left, just trying to remember how to breathe normally again. Marcus, for his part, seemed to be handling the aftermath by pulling back too. He stopped initiating plans the way he used to. He'd send shorter replies when Ethan would text him about getting together. And eventually, about 2 months after the wedding, he actually turned down an invitation to our first married couple dinner party, which Ethan found strange and mentioned to me. "Is Marcus acting weird lately?" And I said, "I don't know, maybe he's just busy with work," which was the first of many small lies I would tell over the following months. I'll be honest that there was a period of a few weeks where I genuinely believed I might get away with this completely, where I thought if Marcus and I both just quietly distanced ourselves and never spoke of it again, this could become something that simply never technically got confirmed to anyone, even though it had definitely happened. I know now how twisted that logic was, but at the time, it felt like the only path forward that didn't involve blowing up my entire marriage. 4 months after the wedding is when things really started to unravel. Ethan's cousin had also been at the wedding and had apparently seen Marcus and me walking back into the reception hall about 90 seconds apart that night, looking flushed and strange. And while she hadn't thought much of it at the time, she mentioned it offhandedly to her sister, who mentioned it to Ethan's mother during some unrelated family conversation about wedding memories. Nothing about it was said with any suspicion attached. It was just small talk, somebody remembering a random detail from the day. But Ethan's mother, who has always had sharper instincts than people give her credit for, apparently sat with that detail for a while and eventually mentioned it to Ethan. Not as an accusation, just as a strange offhand comment. She said something like, "It's funny, your cousin said she saw, Marcus and Sophie come back in from outside around the same time that night. Wonder what that was about. Probably nothing." And Ethan, being Ethan, didn't think much of it in the moment either. It was the kind of comment that would have died there completely, except that it apparently planted something in his memory that started connecting to other small things he had noticed without fully processing at the time. My distance from Marcus over the past few months, my vagueness about why I no longer wanted to see him, my strange mood on the honeymoon that I had blamed on exhaustion. Ethan started asking me small questions over the following weeks. Not accusations exactly, just this steady drip of curiosity that I now understand was him quietly trying to piece something together without wanting to believe what it might mean. He'd ask things like, "Did something happen between you and Marcus at the wedding?" And I'd say, "What? No, of course not. Why would you even ask that?" And he'd say, "I don't know, just something my mom mentioned. Probably nothing." And I would feel this hot spike of fear, followed immediately by relief when he'd let it drop. There was one specific evening, about 3 weeks into this pattern, where we were watching the wedding video for the first time together, something our videographer had finally finished editing. And I remember sitting on the couch next to Ethan, feeling my stomach twist tighter and tighter as the footage moved chronologically toward the reception. Knowing exactly what was coming, even though the actual hallway obviously hadn't been filmed, there was a wide shot during the toasts of me watching Marcus speak, and Ethan paused the video at one point and said, "You look like you're about to cry there," which I was in the moment. Not from guilt exactly, but from the sheer emotional weight of the day. And I just said, "Yeah, it was a beautiful toast." And he nodded and kept watching. But I spent the rest of that video with my heart hammering, waiting for some angle of footage to somehow reveal what had happened, even though I knew logically the camera crew had been inside filming the reception the whole time and could not possibly have caught anything there. There was another night around this same period where Ethan came home from getting drinks with a work friend and mentioned, almost as an aside, that his friend had asked how married life was treating him. And Ethan told me he'd said something like, "Great, except Marcus has been acting distant lately. I don't know what that's about." And I remember feeling this fresh wave of nausea at hearing that Ethan was now noticing the pattern independently through other people's observations, not just his mother's offhand comment, which meant the web of small evidence was quietly expanding beyond just the two of us. This happened multiple times over about a 6-week period. Small questions, small deflections, small moments of relief that never actually resolved anything, because the truth was still sitting there underneath everything. I want to be honest that during this period, I made the same mistake I had made once before, which was that instead of using these moments as an opportunity to finally tell the truth, I actively worked to shut down his suspicion. I remember one night specifically where he asked more directly than he had before. He said, "Sophie, I need you to be honest with me. Did something happen between you and Marcus at the wedding?" I've had this feeling for weeks, and I can't shake it. And instead of telling him the truth, which even in that moment some part of me knew was the right thing to do, I got defensive. I said, "I can't believe you're asking me this on top of everything we've built. Are you seriously this insecure about your own best friend?" And I want to be honest, that I knew exactly what I was doing when I said it. I was using his trust in me and his love for Marcus as a weapon against the one moment he had tried to act on a real and correct instinct. And it worked completely. He backed off immediately. He apologized. He said, "You're right, I'm sorry. I don't know why I keep thinking about this." And I remember feeling this brief surge of relief, followed by an even deeper wave of shame, because I had just watched my husband apologize for correctly sensing something. To me, for correctly suspecting that I had betrayed him on our own wedding day, the actual unraveling, when it finally happened, did not come from his mother's offhand comment or from any of his careful, suspicious questions. It came from Marcus himself. About 5 months after the wedding, Marcus had apparently been carrying his own version of this weight the entire time, and it had been eating at him in ways I hadn't fully appreciated because I had been so focused on managing my own guilt. I found out much later, through the same mutual friend who eventually told me most of what happened at that bar, that Marcus had actually started seeing a therapist of his own in the months after the wedding, specifically because of the guilt, and that his therapist had apparently told him something like, "Carrying a secret of this size inside a friendship you value is not sustainable. You need to either make peace with never telling him, or you need to tell him." But the current arrangement of pretending it never happened while also avoiding him completely is not a stable place to live indefinitely. And apparently that, combined with his own accumulating guilt every time Ethan reached out to make plans and Marcus had to find another excuse to decline, finally pushed him toward the decision. He called Ethan one evening and asked to meet up, just the two of them, which wasn't unusual on its own. They'd been friends for 15 years. But Ethan told me later that something in Marcus's voice on the phone made him nervous before they'd even sat down. They met at a bar the two of them had gone to since college, and Ethan said Marcus could barely make eye contact the entire time. They ordered drinks, and Marcus apparently sat there for almost 20 minutes, making small talk, clearly working up to something, before he finally said it directly. Ethan told me afterward that Marcus said something almost exactly like this. "Ethan, I need to tell you something, and I need you to know that telling you this is destroying me, but I can't keep carrying it anymore. Something happened between me and Sophie the night of your wedding." And Ethan said he actually laughed at first, thought it was some kind of joke because it was such an insane thing to hear from his best friend of 15 years. And Marcus had to say it again, more directly. "This isn't a joke, Ethan. I'm so sorry. It happened once. It was during the reception. We've never spoken about it since, and I've regretted it every single day." And Ethan told me later that he just sat there, completely frozen, not able to process what he was hearing, and eventually asked, "Are you telling me you slept with my wife on our wedding day?" And Marcus said yes, and started crying, which Ethan said was almost the most disorienting part of the whole conversation. watching his oldest friend break down in tears while confessing to the worst betrayal of his life. Ethan apparently sat in that bar for almost another hour afterward, not saying much, just staring at his drink, while Marcus kept trying to fill the silence with apologies, saying things like, "I understand if you never want to speak to me again. I understand if this ends us. I just couldn't keep lying to you anymore." And Ethan told me later that the strangest part of sitting there was that some small part of his brain was still running through logistics, automatically, the way it always did, wondering how he was going to get home, whether he should order another drink, whether he needed to call someone, even while the rest of him felt like the floor had genuinely disappeared from under his life. I was in the kitchen when I heard his car pull into the driveway that night, and I remember the specific sound of his keys in the lock taking longer than usual, like his hands weren't quite steady. And Ethan came home that night, and I knew the second he walked through the door that something had fundamentally changed. His face was this color I had never seen on him before, somewhere between gray and hollowed out. His tie was loosened in this uncharacteristic way. Ethan, who always hung his coat up immediately, just let it slide off his shoulders onto a kitchen chair. And he didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stood in the doorway, looking at me. And I felt my whole body go cold, because some part of me already knew exactly what this was about. I remember my hands were wet. I had been washing a single coffee mug at the sink for what felt like way too long. Some part of my body already sensing something was wrong before my mind had caught up to it. He finally said, "Marcus told me everything, and I want you to know right now that I already know. So please do not lie to me again." And I stood there in our kitchen, feeling the floor essentially drop out from under me, because there was no more room to maneuver, no more room for vague deflections or wounded insecurity accusations. The truth was already sitting in the room with us. I tried anyway. I want to be honest about that. I tried to say, "Ethan, let me explain. It's not what you think." And he just held up his hand and said, "Please don't. Don't make this worse by trying to spin it. Just tell me if it's true. Yes or no?" And I said yes. And watching his face when I said that single word is something I don't think I will ever be able to fully describe. It wasn't an explosion of anger. It was something quieter and somehow worse. This kind of collapse from the inside, like watching someone's entire understanding of their own life crumble in real time. He asked me how long I'd known, that he'd been asking me directly for weeks whether something had happened. And I told him the truth this time, that I had known the entire time, and that I had lied to his face every single time he asked, and that I had specifically weaponized his trust against him by calling him insecure when he was actually just perceptive and correct. And watching him hear that second piece of information was almost worse than the original confession, because I watched him realize in real time that it wasn't just a single moment of weakness at the wedding. It was an entire year of active, deliberate deception that followed it. There was a stretch of maybe 10 minutes where neither of us said very much at all, just standing on opposite sides of the kitchen island, him gripping the edge of the counter so hard his knuckles had gone pale, me not knowing whether to move closer or give him space. And finally, he asked, in this quiet, flat voice I had never heard from him before, "Was any of it real? The wedding, the vows, all of it? Or was I just performing a role that whole day?" And I told him, yes, it was real. I meant every single word I said to him at that altar. And he just shook his head slowly and said, "Then how? How do you mean it and still do that within hours? I genuinely don't understand how both of those things can be true in the same person. And I didn't have an answer for him, because some days, even now, I'm not sure I fully understand it myself. He said something that has stayed with me every single day since, which was, "You didn't just betray me once, Sophie. You watched me doubt my own judgment for months, and you made me feel crazy for trusting my gut. And I don't know which part of this I'm supposed to forgive first, the wedding or everything after it." I tried to explain the context, the pressure of the wedding planning, the years of feeling like our relationship had become too predictable, the champagne, the specific charged moment in that hallway. And while everything I was saying was technically true, I understand now that I was still fundamentally trying to make him understand why it made sense, which is its own form of avoiding full responsibility. At one point, he asked, almost desperately, was it Marcus specifically? Was there something about him? Or would it have been anyone who happened to be standing in that hallway with me that night? And I remember not knowing how to answer that honestly, because both things felt true. That it was specifically Marcus and everything he represented to me, and also that some part of it had been about proving to myself that I was still capable of being wanted spontaneously, outside the structure of a life I had already started to feel trapped inside of. And I said something like, "I don't know, Ethan. I think it was both." And he just laughed, this awful, hollow laugh with no humor in it at all, and said, "Great. So I don't even get a clean answer for why my marriage ended on the day it began." He listened to all of it with this terrible, controlled calm. And then he said, "I'm not interested in why right now. I need to figure out if I can be married to someone who let me apologize to her for questioning the one thing that turned out to be completely true." Ethan moved into a hotel that same night. He didn't even wait until morning. He packed an overnight bag with this eerie efficiency, like some part of him had been quietly preparing for this exact possibility for weeks without fully admitting it to himself. And I let him go, because I genuinely didn't have any argument left to make. The weeks that followed were some of the loneliest of my entire life. He answered texts, but only about logistics. Who was picking up what from the house, whether the mail forwarding had been set up. Nothing personal at all. Our families, who had spent an entire wedding weekend blending so beautifully, my parents and his parents becoming genuinely close friends over that year of engagement, now existed in this horrible quiet, as if the past had never happened. Frozen limbo. My mother asked me directly what had happened, and I told her a version of the truth, stripped down to its most basic facts. And she just sat there quietly for a long moment before saying, "Sophie, on your wedding day?" And I didn't have any answer that made it sound like anything other than exactly as bad as it was. My father, who tends to be quieter than my mother about most emotional things, handled it differently. He didn't ask me many questions at all. He just went very still when my mother told him. And the next time I saw him in person, at their house a couple weeks later, he hugged me for a long time at the door, longer than he usually does, and said, "I'm not going to lecture you, Sophie. You already know. I just need you to know that your mother and I still love you, no matter what." And something about the complete absence of any judgment in his voice actually made me cry harder than any lecture could have, because some part of me had almost wanted him to be angry, to yell, to give me something to push back against, instead of this quiet, unconditional acceptance that somehow made the weight of what I'd done feel even heavier to carry. I remember she asked me a second question a few days later, once the initial shock had worn off a little, which was almost harder to answer than the first one. She said, do you understand that this isn't just about Ethan anymore? This affects how his family sees our whole family now. And I understood immediately what she meant, because my mother and Ethan's mother had built this genuine friendship over the engagement year. Regular coffee dates, a shared group chat about wedding details that had continued long after the wedding itself, just because they enjoyed talking to each other. And all of that evaporated in the space of a single phone call once Ethan's mother found out what had actually happened. My mother told me later, months afterward, that she had reached out once to Ethan's mother after everything came out, just to check in, to say she was so sorry for what her daughter had done. And Ethan's mother had been polite but distant on the phone, in a way that made it clear the friendship itself was now a casualty of what I'd done, not just my marriage. And my mother cried after that call, in a way I hadn't seen her cry since my grandmother passed away. Which is its own specific kind of guilt to carry. Watching your own mother grieve a friendship she lost because of your choices. Ethan's mother, who I had grown close to during the engagement, stopped speaking to me entirely, which, given how sharp her instincts had turned out to be, I understood completely. I sent her a single message a few weeks after everything came out, an attempt at an apology, and she never responded, and I don't blame her for that at all. I found out through mutual friends that Marcus's friendship with Ethan, the 15-year friendship that had survived college and job changes and every other normal stress two friends go through, did not survive this at all. Ethan apparently told Marcus after that conversation at the bar that he never wanted to see him again. And as far as I know, they have not spoken since. Which means in a single night, I managed to destroy not just my marriage, but the oldest friendship either of these men had ever had. I heard through the same mutual friend who told me most of this secondhand information that Marcus ended up selling his portion of the woodworking business he had built with a partner in our city and moved almost 3 hours away to start over somewhere. His history with both of us wasn't attached to every room he walked into. And apparently, he still carries a heavy guilt about the whole thing, even now. More than I initially would have expected, given how easily I had once been able to compartmentalize what happened. Our mutual friend mentioned that Marcus had said something to her once about how he thought about that hallway almost every day. Not with any kind of longing, just with this steady, low-grade regret about the fact that a 15-year friendship, one of the most important relationships in his life outside of family, had ended in a single conversation at a bar because of 10 minutes of poor judgment neither of us had been able to walk back from. And I think about that sometimes. The fact that I am not even the only person whose entire adult life got quietly rearranged by what happened in that hallway. That Marcus lost something enormous too. A friendship he had built since he was 18 years old. And that loss doesn't often make it into how I initially framed this story to myself, where I tended to think mostly in terms of what I had cost Ethan and what I had cost myself, without fully reckoning with the fact that Marcus, too, is out there somewhere carrying the weight of a choice he made just as fully as I made mine. Our old friend group, the same people who had danced at our wedding and toasted to our future, splintered almost immediately along quiet, unspoken lines. Some of them sided openly with Ethan and simply stopped responding to my texts altogether. One of my former bridesmaids sent me a message about a month after everything came out, saying, "I love you, Soph, but I can't be neutral about this one. I hope you understand." And I did understand, even though it hurt in a way I wasn't fully prepared for. A few of them tried to stay neutral for a while, still checking in occasionally. But even those friendships cooled noticeably over the following months, conversations getting shorter, invitations to group things quietly stopping without any real explanation. Until eventually, I realized I had lost nearly the entire social world Ethan and I had built together over 5 years. Not because anyone made a dramatic announcement about taking sides, but just because that's what naturally happens when you're the one who did something this catastrophic. Ethan filed for divorce about 2 months after that conversation in our kitchen. He was quiet and methodical about the entire process, the same way he approached everything in his life. No dramatic confrontations, no screaming matches, just careful logistics. Conversations handled through lawyers about the house and our shared accounts. There was one mediation session in particular, about 3 months into the process, that I still think about, sitting across a long conference table from Ethan with our respective lawyers on either side, both of us being painfully, almost formally polite to each other, passing documents back and forth about who would keep which pieces of furniture, how the house sale would be split, whether I wanted to keep any of the wedding gifts that had come from his side of the family. And at one point during a break in the session, I found myself standing next to him briefly at the coffee station in the hallway outside, both of us reaching for the same carafe. And there was this strange beat of forced normalcy, him saying, "You can have the cream, I don't take it anyway," in this flat, polite voice that belonged to a stranger more than to the man I had married. And I remember he was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 coffees already ordered, mine made exactly the way I liked it even now, which almost undid me before I'd even sat down, that he still knew that detail and still cared enough to get it right. And I spent most of the conversation trying to explain everything I had been working through in therapy, which I had started attending on my own by that point. The restlessness I had felt for years before the wedding, the specific ways I had been quietly resenting his caution and predictability without ever telling him directly, the way all of that pressure had built up silently until it exploded in a single terrible decision in a hallway. And at one point, I even brought up the camping trip from years earlier, the festival we never drove to, trying to explain that this hadn't come from nowhere, that there had been a slow accumulation of small disappointments long before Marcus was ever part of the equation. And Ethan actually nodded slowly at that. He said, "I remember that camping trip. I remember you seemed quiet after. I just never asked why because I assumed it was something small." And hearing him say that landed strangely. This small confirmation that the distance between us had been real and mutual in its blindness, not just some story I had constructed after the fact to excuse myself. And he listened to every word of it with this patient, exhausted expression. And when I finished, he said something that I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count. He said, "Sophie, I actually believe everything you just told me. I believe you were unhappy. I believe I probably wasn't giving you what you needed in certain ways. But none of that required you to sleep with my best friend at our wedding, And then let me apologize to you for noticing? If you were unhappy, you had 5 years to tell me. You had our entire engagement to tell me. You even had that entire honeymoon to tell me. And instead, you let me believe I had built the best day of my life with someone who was lying to me from the very first hour of our marriage. And there was a long pause after he said that, where neither of us touched our coffee. And I finally asked him quietly if he thought we could have fixed things if I had told him the truth early, even just the morning after the wedding. And he sat with that question for a long time before answering. And when he did, his answer wasn't what I expected. He said, "I honestly don't know, Sophie. Maybe. Probably it still would have ended us, but at least I would have spent that year believing my own judgment instead of doubting it every single day. And that's the part I don't think I can forgive. Not really the wedding itself. The year of watching myself go slowly crazy while you told me I was the problem for noticing something completely real. And I sat there with absolutely nothing to say, because every part of that was true. There was no version of my growth or my therapy or my newfound self-awareness that erased the specific timeline of what had actually happened. The divorce finalized about 8 months after that conversation in the kitchen. I moved out of the house. We had bought together and into a small apartment across town on my own. And I want to be honest that the first few months alone in that apartment were some of the hardest of my life. Not because I didn't understand why this had happened to me, but because understanding it didn't make it hurt any less. There were nights during that first stretch where I would sit on the floor of my mostly unfurnished living room, boxes still half unpacked because I couldn't summon the energy to finish setting up a home I hadn't chosen and didn't particularly want, and just replay the wedding day over and over in my head, trying to locate the exact moment where things could have gone differently. Whether it was in that hallway or months before it in some quiet, unaddressed resentment I had let build for years, there was one particular week during that period that I still think about, when our wedding photographer's final printed album, the physical leather-bound one we had ordered almost a year in advance, back when we were still happily married, arrived at my new address by mistake because the shipping information hadn't been updated yet. And I remember standing in my kitchen, holding this beautiful, heavy book that I hadn't asked for and didn't know what to do with. And I sat on my kitchen floor for almost an hour that night, slowly turning every page, looking at photo after photo of myself in that white dress, looking so certain, so happy, next to a man who had no idea what I had already done to him hours before. Some of those very photos were taken. And I remember closing the album at the very last page, a shot of the two of us walking away from the reception, hand in hand, under a shower of sparklers, and just sitting there on the floor of my empty kitchen, crying in a way I hadn't let myself cry since everything came out. Not for myself exactly, more for the version of that day that the photos preserved so perfectly, a version that had already stopped being fully true the moment the shutter clicked. I ended up boxing that album away in the back of a closet, unable to throw it out and unable to look at it again for a long time afterward. I started attending therapy more seriously, not performatively, the way I had initially approached it while trying to win Ethan back, but actually trying to understand how I had become a person capable of doing what I did. My therapist, a woman named Dr. Reyes, who has this quality of being able to ask a single question that unravels an entire month of avoidance, spent our early sessions mostly just having me describe the years before the wedding in detail. And I remember one session in particular where she asked me to describe specifically the last time before the wedding that I had told Ethan directly, in plain language, that I was unhappy with something in our relationship. Not hinted at it, not vented to Marcus about it, but said it straight to Ethan's face. And I sat there for what felt like several minutes, unable to come up with a single example. And she just let the silence sit there until I said out loud, I don't think I ever actually did that. Not once in 5 years. And she said, that's important information, Sophie. And I understood what she meant. She helped me see some of the patterns over the following months. The way I avoided direct conflict my whole life, going back even before Ethan. The way I had learned as a kid to keep my own needs quiet in a household where my parents fought loudly and often, so that I associated stating my needs directly with the risk of causing exactly that kind of explosive conflict. And how instead, I had learned to let things build silently until they came out sideways, in some other form entirely. A passive comment, a withdrawal, or in this case, something catastrophic. Reyes also helped me understand the specific dynamic with Marcus more clearly. The way I had confused excitement with worthiness, treating his spontaneity and his ease of presence as evidence that he somehow deserved me more, or made me more myself than a man who was simply steady and reliable, and completely devoted to me in his own quieter way. And she pointed out something that took me a long time to fully absorb, which was that novelty and depth are not actually opposites, that plenty of couples find ways to build spontaneity and adventure into steady, committed partnerships, and that what I had actually been missing wasn't necessarily something only available outside my marriage. It was something I had never once tried to build inside it, through honest conversation, choosing instead to quietly resent Ethan for not offering it unprompted, while never once asking directly for what I wanted. But understanding the psychological mechanics of it doesn't change the fact of what happened. It just means I'm hopefully less likely to do something like it again, which is something, I suppose, though it doesn't give me back anything I lost. The year that followed the divorce was strange in its own specific way. Not dramatic exactly, just quiet and slow. I threw myself into work in a way I hadn't before, took on projects I would have previously turned down for being too demanding. I think partly because the busyness gave me something to organize my days around besides the absence of the life I had expected to be living. My mother worried about me during this period. She'd call just to check in and ask if I was eating properly, if I was seeing people, if I was doing anything besides work and therapy. And I remember telling her at one point that I didn't feel like I deserved to rush toward being okay again, that some part of me felt like sitting in the discomfort of what I'd caused was the least I could do. And she said something gently that stuck with me, which was, Sophie, punishing yourself forever doesn't give Ethan his wedding day back either. At some point, staying miserable stops being accountability and starts being its own kind of self-indulgence. And I've thought about that a lot since. About a year after the divorce finalized, I heard through a mutual friend from the old friend group, one of the few people who still occasionally talks to both of us, that Ethan had started seeing someone new, a woman named Claire, who he had met through a community woodworking class he had actually started taking that fall, which struck me immediately because it was such an un-Ethan thing to do, signing up for something spontaneous and new, completely unprompted. And when I heard this detail specifically, I remember feeling a very particular kind of ache that had nothing to do with jealousy over Claire as a person, and everything to do with the realization that it had taken losing me for Ethan to finally give himself permission to try something outside his own routine. The exact quality I had spent years quietly wishing he possessed while I was still in the marriage. And I looked her up online, which I know I shouldn't have done, but did anyway. And she seemed lovely, warm, creative. The kind of person who posts photos of half-finished furniture projects with genuinely excited captions about learning something new. And in almost every photo, Ethan looked lighter than I remembered him looking, even in our own wedding photos. Like some weight had been quietly set down that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. I saw one photo, a few months later, of the two of them at some outdoor market, laughing at something off camera. And Ethan had this easy, unguarded smile that I don't think I ever actually saw directed at me. Not really. Not even on our wedding day, if I'm being fully honest with myself now, looking back at it. Because even that day, some part of him was managing logistics, and some part of me was already quietly unraveling toward the worst decision of my life. There was another photo, a few weeks after that one, that I keep returning to more than I probably should. The two of them at what looked like some kind of small showcase for the woodworking class, a table of finished projects behind them, and Ethan was holding up this simple wooden box he had apparently made himself, grinning at the camera in this proud, unguarded way. And Claire had her hand on his shoulder, looking at him rather than at the camera. This small, private smile on her face, like she was genuinely delighted just watching him be proud of something. And I remember sitting with that photo for a long time, thinking about how many hours of our own marriage I had spent quietly wishing Ethan would try something like that. Something imperfect and handmade and a little bit risky. And how strange it was that it took losing everything for him to finally give himself that permission. And how I would never get to be the person standing next to him with my hand on his shoulder when he did. I ran into Ethan once by accident, about a year and a half after the divorce, at a hardware store, of all places. Both of us reaching for something on an end cap display, and there was this brief, awful moment of recognition before either of us said anything. And he was polite, genuinely polite, asked how I was doing in this careful, neutral tone, and I asked about him, and he mentioned Claire briefly, not with any cruelty in his voice, just as a simple fact of his life now. And I said, "I'm happy for you, Ethan." Genuinely. And I meant it, even as it was breaking something quietly in my chest to say it out loud. And he said, "Thank you, Sophie. Take care of yourself," and walked toward the checkout. And I stood in that aisle for a long time after he left, the same way I had once stood frozen in a grocery store aisle after running into Marcus, except this time there was no charged tension underneath it, just a clean, simple grief, the kind that comes from finally accepting something is actually over. I still think about our wedding day sometimes, the way Ethan looked at me walking down the aisle, so sincere, so certain that this was the best day of his life. The way Marcus's toast made half the room cry. The way I stood there in that hallway afterward, smoothing my dress, feeling sick, before walking back in and dancing at my own reception like nothing had happened. And I think the part that sits with me the most, even now, is that I don't think I was lying to myself completely when I felt happy standing at that altar. I think some part of me genuinely meant every vow I said that day. I just didn't understand yet what I was capable of doing to the person I meant them to only a few hours later. I've tried, in therapy, to sit with the specific question of what I would do differently if I somehow got to live that year again. And the honest answer isn't really about that hallway at all. It's about all the small moments in the years before it. The camping trip in the storm, the canceled festival drive, the string quartet I never fought harder for. Every single instance where I chose to let a quiet resentment calcify instead of saying the simple sentence, "Ethan, I need you to try harder to meet me in the unexpected moments." Or even just, "Ethan, I'm scared this relationship is becoming too small for both of us. Sentences that feel so obvious now and felt completely impossible to say out loud back then. Dr. Reyes asked me once whether I thought I could have that same kind of honest conversation now in some future relationship if the same restlessness started creeping in again. And I told her, I hope so. Though I also told her I'm terrified of finding out I'm wrong about that. That maybe some patterns don't fully rewire just because you understand where they came from. I haven't dated anyone seriously since the divorce, not out of some deliberate decision to punish myself indefinitely, more because I genuinely don't trust my own judgment yet in the specific moments where restlessness and connection start to blur together. And I'd rather sit with that uncertainty, honestly, than rush into something and risk repeating the exact pattern that cost me everything the last time. And now, Ethan is out there somewhere, taking woodworking classes with a woman who makes him laugh in a way I apparently never fully managed to. Building small, handmade things, and standing in outdoor markets with an ease I spent years quietly craving from him and never once asked for directly. And I am here, in this smaller apartment, most nights alone, replaying the exact sequence of choices that led me from that altar to that hallway to an empty kitchen, where my husband told me he didn't know which part of this he was supposed to forgive first. Not that I expect anyone reading this to have much sympathy left for me by this point. And honestly, I'm not sure I have much left for myself either. Some nights I let myself think about the version of that day that could have existed if I had just told him the truth the morning after, instead of the version I actually lived, where I danced at my own reception with a secret already curdling inside me. And I don't know if honesty that early would have saved the marriage. It might not have. Ethan might have walked away from me that very same week either way, but at least he would have gotten to spend the rest of that year believing in his own judgment instead of apologizing to me for trusting it. And I think that specific loss, the year I stole from his own sense of himself, is the part of this I will carry the longest, longer even than the marriage itself. I think about his vows sometimes, the line about love feeling like a house, something steady you could return to every day and trust would still be standing. And there's a specific cruelty in how literally I proved him wrong about that within hours of him saying it. That the steady thing he thought he'd built with me turned out to have a hallway in it he never knew about, a room he didn't find out existed until Marcus finally opened the door to it 5 months later. And I don't think Ethan will ever build another house-shaped kind of love without at least a small, permanent crack of doubt somewhere in the foundation. Not because he's fragile. He isn't. He's one of the steadiest people I have ever known. But because I specifically taught him that steadiness and trust are not actually the same thing as safety, that you can do everything right, show up every day, choose the same person over and over without wavering, and still come home one night to find out the whole structure was resting on a lie. The last time I let myself sit with the wedding album, the one I finally worked up the courage to look through again about a year later instead of leaving it boxed in the closet, I noticed something in one of the photos I hadn't paid attention to before. A wide shot from during the reception, taken from across the room. And if you look closely enough at the edge of the frame, you can just barely make out a sliver of that side hallway near the coat check. Empty in the photo. Taken probably an hour before anything happened there. And I don't know why that specific detail undid me the way it did. Maybe because it was proof that the day really had been ordinary and lovely and completely unremarkable, right up until the exact moment I chose to make it something else entirely. That nothing about that hallway waiting empty in the background of someone's photograph forced what happened later. that it was just an empty hallway until I decided to walk into it. And I close the album now, and I put it back in the closet. And most nights, that's where I leave it. A version of the best day of my life, sitting quietly in a box I'm not ready to open again for a while. Not unlike the version of myself I used to be, before I found out exactly what I was capable of doing to the people who loved me most.